Well, after Roosevelt took over, as the 1930s progressed, labor started to regain their strength. So there'd been this situation where they fought really hard for a long time. Then during the Progressive era, they made a lot of advances. Then in the 1920s, those were rolled back. Now they're starting to go forward again. 1935 saw the formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a national labor organization that later merged with the American Federation of Labor to become the AFL-CIO, which is still around today. They were helped along by that Keynesian economic approach that FDR was taking and that was starting to be taken by other countries as well, which basically, said that spending, government spending and people's spending is what will counteract a depression, and that higher wages, instead of lowering the wages of workers when the economy is bad, make them a little bit higher, and then they'll go out and spend money, and that can turn things around. In 4 years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had pulled the country significantly to the left, instituting social programs that progressives could only have dreamed of. And this all happened pretty quickly. A lot of conservative Republicans were accusing FDR of being a socialist or even a communist. But whereas accusations like that would have been seriously damaging to someone 10 years before, let's say in 1922, after 2 or 3 years of depression, Great Depression, a pretty significant portion of the American public, they weren't feeling that great about unrestrained capitalism. And a lot of them were sort of returning to the mindset that a lot of people had had during the Progressive era. Nonetheless, there were some people who believed that Roosevelt wasn't bringing things far enough to the left, who felt like he was still taking it too easy on some of the corporate interests in America. It's kind of like Teddy Roosevelt's accusations of William Howard Taft 20 years before, even though Taft had been going after monopolies pretty much full time. Now, one of the people who was saying that Roosevelt wasn't going far enough to the left was Senator from Louisiana, Huey Long. Long was so dissatisfied with FDR's policies not being far enough to the left that he challenged him in the Democratic primary when FDR was running for re-election for the 1936 election. During that primary run, Long, who was a populist and who was very charismatic and who really resonated particularly with working class people, had as his campaign slogan, "Share our wealth." Now let's take a moment. Let's pause here and think about how weird this is in the 21st century to think about a Louisiana politician, a Democrat, who was a radical populist who thought FDR was too soft on capitalism. Essentially, it was a different world. He challenges FDR in the primary, and actually, early on was polling pretty high and doing pretty well. Let's take a look at part of one of his speeches.
According to the tables which we have assembled, it is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat. The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with.
He was doing well enough in the polling that he had Roosevelt and Roosevelt supporters a little bit worried, fearful that a split in the ticket would benefit the Republicans and potentially cause Roosevelt to lose re-election. Long had some things working against him. He was caught up in a minor scandal that was related to Father Charles Coughlin, whom we talked about before when we were talking about radio hosts, or not televangelists, radio evangelists, I guess you would call them, radio preachers in the 1920s. Coughlin was a very popular one, who initially had strongly supported Roosevelt, but like Long, felt like Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough. So they seemed like natural allies. Unfortunately, as the administration of Roosevelt went on, Coughlin started going off on tangents on the radio about how much he hated Jewish people and about how it was all a great big Jewish conspiracy and maybe this Hitler guy's not so bad. So that doesn't really help you politically when you're trying to appeal to the voters that Long was. Nonetheless, he was doing pretty well until his campaign was cut short when he was assassinated, actually by a guy that he had. Well, the guy had the impression when Long was governor that Long was going to give him a job that never materialized, and the guy was upset about it, so he shot him and he died, which pretty well, opened the way up for Roosevelt to cruise to a pretty easy re-election. However, this had put a little bit of a scare into him, which is what third parties and in this case primary challengers can sometimes do. So, after his re-election, Roosevelt tacked even farther to the left. So he had been pretty liberal in the modern sense in the first couple of years, and then he kind of backed off a little bit. And when that happened, he lost some of his support, went to Huey Long. So he tacked back toward the left and away from the middle after his re-election. He had gotten elected the first time, promising the American people a New Deal. Once he saw that he was losing some support because of his easing off on those things, then for his second election campaign, he promised a second New Deal. And in fact, after he was re-inaugurated, he sort of in an echo of his first election, he immediately embarked on several bold new social programs, including the Rural Electrification Agency, which was closely connected to the TVA, which he had established at the beginning of his previous administration. In 1934, 80% of farms in the American South had no electricity at all. So the Rural Electrification Agency that was continuing the process of building those hydroelectric dams and generating electricity and getting those electric lines run out into the rural areas. Also, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, very similar to the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, except that the CCC was a thing that you joined, kind of like the Peace Corps later on. And you had to be an unemployed, unmarried male. For the WPA, you didn't have those requirements. You had to be unemployed, but a lot of women worked for the WPA. Married people worked for the WPA. It wasn't sort of like joining the Army where you're going to be doing this for a set period of time, but there were certain projects that the WPA administered, including CCC type things like building roads and bridges. But another example is that the WPA agency hired a lot of unemployed teachers and journalists in the American South to go out and interview every living ex-slave that they could find, and store those interviews in an archive, which has been very, very valuable, obviously, for historians. So not just manual labor. Also, the Wagner Act was passed that protected the right of collective bargaining and further strengthened unions. And finally, this thing that the earlier President Roosevelt, Teddy, had proposed some time before, Social Security insurance. It is passed through and becomes a thing, Social Security. The idea that after you have spent a lifetime working and you are in your twilight years, you don't get thrown out on the street because you're not able to work. You will have some income that you have paid in on. Today, people take that for granted. 12 years ago now, back in 2008, which is dating the recording of this lecture. Let's drop out the 12 years part. Let's just say 2008, when Obama and McCain were running against each other. Maybe you've seen footage of this. There was this old lady who was saying that Obama was a socialist and he better keep his hands off her Social Security and welfare, which is kind of a strange thing because those are social programs that, when Social Security was implemented and welfare and Medicare in particular was later in the 60s, the opponents of Roosevelt and later Johnson accused them of being socialists and called Social Security a communist scam. That's, again, a different world. In short, the Great Depression brought about some major changes in Americans' attitude toward the role of government. You will recall that during the Progressive era, a time during which both major political parties leaned a little bit toward the left, that there was the general feeling that the government, the federal government, should be an activist, interventionist government and should be actively involved in regulating things. But then, at the end of Wilson's administration, the 1920s came in with a totally different mindset, that it was more of a laissez-faire mindset, that the government should not regulate, they should in fact deregulate and allow businesses to just proceed forward and let the market adjust itself. And then a lot of people looked at that, and then they looked at the fact that the decade ended in a Great Depression and thought to themselves, well, maybe that's not the best way. So by the end of the 1930s, there was no longer even a sharply divided question among Americans, except for a small handful, as to whether or not the government should be involved in the economy. Everyone pretty much agreed, even many conservatives by this point, that the government should be involved in the economy. So now it was only a question of how should the government be involved and perhaps how much. All right, well, that is the end of this part of the course. We've now caught up on all the material that you'll need for the midterm, and when we resume, when I post the next of these lecture videos, we will be embarking upon yet another global conflagration. Until then, good luck on the exam, and I hope